The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every breath, every movement seemed amplified by the oppressive silence pressing down on the room. Malcolm Hayes stood firm behind the defense table, his hands gripping its edge, knuckles turning white. He refused to look away from Judge Henry Whitmore, whose piercing blue eyes bore into him with the weight of decades of unchecked authority. Across the courtroom, Andre Carter sat hunched in his chair, his shoulders squared but his hands trembling slightly beneath the table. His dark brown eyes, usually full of warmth and kindness, were now dulled by exhaustion and fear. His entire life, his reputation, his career, his future, hung in the balance. On the other side of the room, James Calloway paced confidently, his tailored navy blue suit crisp, his every movement calculated. The district attorney relished moments like these. He turned toward the jury, flashing a smile that was too polished, too rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Calloway began, his voice smooth, authoritative, "this case is about accountability. The evidence before you is clear. Andre Carter was seen leaving the scene of the robbery, his fingerprints found on the stolen cash, his reckless actions proving beyond a doubt that he—" A loud bang echoed through the room as Malcolm slammed his palm against the defense table. A murmur rippled through the audience. Calloway's mouth twitched in irritation, but Malcolm didn't care. "Objection," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "Prosecution is deliberately misleading the jury. There is no clear evidence tying Mr. Carter to this crime." Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, sighing as if he were utterly bored with the proceedings. He peered down at Malcolm over his glasses, a look of irritation creasing his forehead. "Overruled," Whitmore said, his tone dismissive. "Mr. Hayes, you will not disrupt this court with your baseless objections." Malcolm clenched his jaw. He expected nothing less. Calloway smirked and continued, undeterred. "As I was saying, this isn't just about one man's actions. This is about protecting our community from those who believe they can act without consequence." Malcolm stole a glance at Andre, whose fingers gripped the edges of his chair. He knew what this was. Not a trial, but a performance. One where the system had already written the ending. Then it happened. Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe and scoffed. "Mr. Hayes, I would suggest you know your place before you embarrass yourself further." The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. But it was the way he said them, the emphasis, the sneer, that made the entire courtroom freeze. Know your place. Malcolm's stomach tightened, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His gaze locked onto the judge's face, searching for even a flicker of regret. There was none, just cold indifference. A murmur swept through the gallery. Reporters exchanged glances. A court stenographer hesitated before resuming her typing. A few jurors stiffened in their seats. The cameras were rolling. A low voice from the back of the courtroom cut through the tension. "Did he just say that?" Malcolm inhaled sharply. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. This was bigger than Andre Carter's case now. It was bigger than him. Then a chair scraped loudly against the floor. A figure in the back row shot up to his feet. "Stop! You don't know the whole truth." The courtroom exploded into chaos. But before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. 2 weeks earlier, the streets of Chicago were slick with rain, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the pavement as Andre Carter walked home from his night class. His bag, slung over one shoulder, was packed with graded papers and lesson plans. He had stayed late at school, helping a struggling student catch up. It was just past 10 when he turned onto his quiet residential street, a place he had lived for nearly a decade. Then the flashing red and blue lights sliced through the night. A police cruiser pulled up alongside him, its siren off, but its presence unmistakable. Andre barely had time to register what was happening before 2 officers stepped out, hands on their belts, eyes locked onto him. "Andre Carter?" He hesitated. "Yes?" "Turn around, hands behind your back." "What? What's going on?" His voice was steady, but his pulse had begun to race. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a badge that read Sullivan, grabbed Andre's wrist and twisted it behind his back. The other officer yanked his bag off his shoulder, tossing it onto the sidewalk. "You're under arrest," Sullivan said flatly. "For what?" Andre struggled, but the grip on him was unyielding. "You'll find out soon enough," the second officer muttered, clicking the handcuffs into place. A few neighbors peeked through their windows, but no one stepped outside. The air was thick with the kind of tension that had been simmering in this city for years. As Andre was shoved into the back of the cruiser, he caught a glimpse of Detective Lopez standing near the patrol car, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. Unlike the other officers, Lopez wasn't moving aggressively. He wasn't saying anything either. The doors slammed shut and Andre's world tilted. Across town, Malcolm Hayes sat at his desk, buried in case files when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it. He had been dealing with back-to-back cases all day, but something about the number made him pick up. "Mr. Hayes?" The voice on the other end was shaky. "This is Lisa Carter. They arrested Andre." Malcolm straightened in his chair. "Lisa, slow down. Who arrested him? For what?" I don't know. They just took him, right in front of our house. Wouldn't even tell me why. They said he could call a lawyer once he was processed." Malcolm reached for his jacket. "I'm on my way." He had seen this play out too many times before. A black man arrested without explanation, held in custody while the system decided what to do with him. If he didn't step in now, Andre could get lost in a web of bureaucracy, or worse, be forced into a plea deal before he even knew what he was accused of. Within 20 minutes, Malcolm walked through the doors of the Chicago Police Department's 12th precinct. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale coffee and paperwork. Officers moved about, some barely sparing him a glance, others giving him the same skeptical look he was all too familiar with. At the front desk, an officer barely looked up. "Can I help you?" "Malcolm Hayes, attorney. I'm here for Andre Carter." The officer flipped through a logbook. "No record of him being processed yet." "That's impossible," Malcolm said, his patience thinning. "He was arrested over half an hour ago." "Where is he?" The officer shrugged. "Check back later." Before Malcolm could argue, a voice from behind him spoke. "He's in holding, but you won't be able to see him yet." Malcolm turned to see Detective Lopez, his stance cautious. The man had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone carrying a weight he couldn't quite put down. "Why not?" Malcolm demanded. Lopez exhaled, as if debating how much to say. "Because they don't want you to." "Who's they?" Lopez didn't answer. Instead, he gave Malcolm a long, knowing look. "You didn't hear it from me, but if I were you, I'd start asking the right people the right questions, and I'd do it fast." Malcolm's stomach clenched. He knew exactly what that meant. Something was off. As the hours dragged on, Malcolm's frustration deepened. Every attempt to get access to Andre was stonewalled. No paperwork had been filed. No charges had been listed. It was as if the arrest had been designed to disappear before it could be questioned. Then came the real red flag. While waiting, Malcolm overheard two officers talking. "The surveillance footage from the gas station," one muttered. "Gone." "You sure?" "Yeah, we had it this morning, but now it's missing from the system. No record of it ever being logged." Malcolm's jaw tightened. That video was the key to proving Andre wasn't at the crime scene. If it had conveniently vanished, it meant someone didn't want it found. The weight of the situation settled over him. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was deliberate. He had seen this game before. How evidence could be buried, how narratives could be twisted, how good men like Andre could be chewed up and spit out by a system designed to break them. But not this time. Not on his watch. He wasn't just going to fight for Andre's freedom. He was going to burn down the whole damn lie behind it. "If they think I'm going to let this slide, they don't know me at all," Malcolm muttered as he stepped out of the police station, gripping his phone tightly. The cold night air hit his face, but it did little to cool the frustration boiling inside him. The pieces of this case weren't just falling apart, they were being deliberately erased. By the time he reached his office, the dim glow from the street lamps barely illuminated the sidewalk. He unlocked the door, tossing his coat over the chair as he sat down, rubbing his temples. The walls of his office were lined with case files, legal books, and stacks of documents. But tonight, the only thing that mattered was the folder in front of him, Andre Carter's file. Malcolm flipped through the arrest report again, his eyes scanning each detail. Something wasn't adding up. The prosecution claimed there was an eyewitness, a homeless man who identified Andre as the suspect. But the more Malcolm dug into the man's background, the more questionable it became. The witness, Daryl Henson, had a history of giving testimonies in criminal cases. Too many cases. Daryl Henson, known informant, multiple arrests, unreliable statements in past trials. Malcolm murmured to himself, flipping pages. And yet, the only witness they could find against Andre? A deep sigh escaped his lips as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The entire case rested on a man whose credibility was paper thin. And then there was the missing footage. The original police report stated that security cameras from a nearby gas station had captured Andre Carter near the scene of the robbery. But when Malcolm tried to obtain the footage, the response had been the same at every turn. No record found. How convenient. He reached for his phone, about to call a contact who could help dig deeper, when a sharp knock on the door interrupted him. It was late. Too late for anyone to be stopping by unannounced. Malcolm hesitated before standing up. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of fighting in courtrooms where justice wasn't always welcome. He slowly opened the door. A woman stood there, her auburn hair slightly damp from the mist outside. She was dressed in a navy blue blazer, a notepad tucked under her arm. Her piercing green eyes met his with the kind of intensity that came from years of chasing the truth. "Samantha Reed, Chicago Tribune," she said, extending a hand. "We need to talk." Malcolm studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "If this is about a case, I don't give statements." Samantha smirked, stepping in. "Good, because I'm not here for a quote. I'm here because we both know something is off about this case, and I think we can help each other." Malcolm shut the door behind her, folding his arms. "I don't trust reporters. And I don't trust lawyers who think they can fight the system alone," she shot back. "But if we're both on the right side of this, we don't have a choice." She set her notepad on his desk and slid a manila folder toward him. "Take a look." Malcolm opened it, his eyes scanning the first few pages. His grip tightened. It was a compiled list of cases where the police had lost or altered evidence. Cases where innocent men had been locked away because of errors that always seemed to favor the prosecution. "This isn't new," Samantha continued, sitting down across from him. "I've been covering these stories for years. Fabricated statements, missing footage, coerced confessions. It's all part of the playbook." Malcolm clenched his jaw. "You're saying Andre's case is just another number in their system?" "I'm saying they don't care about truth," Samantha said. "They care about keeping their conviction rate high. They care about control." He ran a hand over his face. "Andre Carter is a teacher. He's got no criminal history, no motive. He was walking home. And yet they want to bury him," Samantha said, leaning forward. "Ask yourself why." Malcolm already had, and the answer was growing clearer by the minute. "Let me guess," he said. "You've got a source." Samantha smiled. "I always do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. "This was sent to me anonymously. It's an internal police memo, one that was never supposed to leave the department." Malcolm took the drive, his heartbeat steady but quickening. "What's on it?" Samantha met his gaze. "A direct order to keep the details of Andre Carter's case under wraps, from someone high up." The weight of the revelation settled between them. If this was true, then this case wasn't just about Andre anymore. It was about a system that thrived on silence, and Malcolm Hayes had never been one to stay quiet. Malcolm's eyes scanned the email. His pulse quickened. They're covering something up, but why? The email was brief, but the weight behind it was staggering. It was an internal police memo, one that should have never left their system. The subject line read, "Directive, Carter Case," and the content was even more damning. "Ensure limited disclosure. Do not engage with external inquiries." That wasn't the kind of instruction given in a routine case. This wasn't about standard protocol. It was about control, suppression. Before Malcolm could even begin piecing the implications together, his phone rang. The caller ID made his stomach tighten. James Calloway. He hesitated for only a second before answering. "Mr. Hayes." Calloway's voice was as smooth as ever, the kind of tone used by men who believed they always had the upper hand. "I believe we need to talk." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the desk. "I'd say that depends." Are you finally ready to drop this baseless case against my client? Calloway chuckled. I think we both know that's not happening, but I'm offering you a way out before things get too complicated. Malcolm knew exactly where this was going. Let me guess. You want me to convince Andre to plead guilty to something he didn't do, and in return, you'll toss him a lighter sentence? Calloway didn't even bother pretending otherwise. 6 months, minimal consequences. He serves his time, and this whole thing goes away. No permanent record, no drawn-out trial, no risk of losing completely. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Or we take this to court, expose your department's negligence, and clear his name. There was a pause, brief but heavy. Then Calloway's voice dropped lower. Not all battles are worth fighting, Mr. Hayes. There it was, the threat beneath the offer. The unspoken warning that Malcolm was making enemies he might not be able to shake. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, forcing his tone to remain even. Andre Carter is an innocent man. I don't deal in plea bargains for cases built on lies. Another pause. Then Calloway sighed, as if Malcolm was nothing more than a stubborn child refusing to see reason. Then I guess we'll see you in court. The line went dead. Malcolm sat still for a long moment, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about Andre anymore. Hours later, Malcolm returned to his office, exhausted but still running on adrenaline. He reached for the doorknob, then stopped. The door was slightly ajar. His pulse spiked as he pushed it open, his lawyer instincts immediately cataloging the scene. His desk drawers were pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. His computer was still on, but something was off. The screen was black, the blinking cursor in the login field as if someone had just tried and failed to access it. Someone had been inside. His breath came slower as he stepped further in, scanning for anything missing. Files were overturned, folders were open, but it wasn't looting. This was deliberate. His eyes landed on the small envelope resting neatly in the center of his desk. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped a picture before reaching for the note inside. Drop the case or you'll regret it. No signature, no details. But the message was clear. Malcolm exhaled, his mind racing through the possibilities. This wasn't just about intimidating him. Whoever had broken in wanted him to know they had access. That meant it wasn't just petty retaliation. It was a warning. And the only way warnings escalated was if the person they were meant for refused to listen. The next morning, Malcolm met Samantha at a small diner just outside downtown. She was already seated in a booth, sipping on coffee, her expression unreadable. She slid a manila folder across the table before he even had a chance to order. "What's this?" he asked. "Your confirmation." Malcolm flipped it open, his eyes skimming over the names, the addresses, the bank transfers. His stomach twisted. Richard Donovan, the mayor of Chicago. Malcolm looked up sharply. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." Samantha leaned in slightly. "It's exactly what you think it is." The documents laid out a pattern: systematic displacement of minority communities, arrests targeting specific neighborhoods, all linked back to real estate acquisitions owned by companies tied to Donovan's office. "This is bigger than just Andre Carter," she said. "He's just one of many. This has been happening for years. People get arrested, forced into plea deals, and by the time they get out, their homes are gone. The city rezones the land, sells it to developers, and the people who used to live there, they have nothing left." Malcolm let out a slow breath, staring down at the evidence in front of him. "They arrest people to justify taking their homes," he murmured. Samantha nodded. "And anyone who fights back either disappears or gets labeled as a troublemaker." Malcolm's hands curled into fists. Andre's arrest had never been about the robbery. It had been about removing him. A tightness settled in Malcolm's chest, an understanding that was equal parts rage and clarity. If Andre Carter's case unraveled, so would the entire operation. That was why they wanted him silenced, why they were willing to break into his office, why Calloway had offered a plea deal so quickly. Malcolm closed the folder and met Samantha's gaze. "We just stepped into something much bigger," he said quietly. She smirked, taking another sip of her coffee. "Good. I was starting to get bored." But Malcolm knew better than to take this lightly. Because now they weren't just fighting for one man's freedom. They were going after an entire system built on corruption and people like Donovan. They didn't go down without a fight. Malcolm sat in his office, staring at the ominous note in his hand. He knew one thing for sure. Backing down was not an option. The paper felt thin between his fingers, but the weight of the message was heavy. Drop the case, or you'll regret it. He exhaled slowly, setting it down on his desk. The last time someone had tried to intimidate him, it hadn't worked. This time wouldn't be any different. The knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. He expected Samantha, but when he opened it, Detective Lopez stood there instead, shifting uncomfortably in the dimly lit hallway. "We need to talk," Lopez said, his voice low. Malcolm stepped aside, letting him in. Lopez hesitated before closing the door behind him. "I shouldn't be here," Lopez muttered, running a hand through his short cropped hair. "But you need to know the truth." Malcolm folded his arms. "You were there the night Andre was arrested. You already knew this was wrong. So what changed?" Lopez exhaled, glancing at the floor. "I saw the reports. Carter wasn't picked up because he fit the suspect description. He was targeted." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "Go on." Lopez pulled out a folded document from his jacket and slid it across the desk. "This is an internal report. Carter wasn't arrested for robbery. He was on a list of community disruptors." Malcolm unfolded the paper and scanned the text. Names, addresses, and notes. Beside Andre's name was a notation in red ink. "Opposed development project. High influence in community." Malcolm's stomach turned. "They're arresting people to push them out of their neighborhoods," Lopez admitted. "Anyone who fights back, anyone who challenges what's happening, gone. Either through false charges, intimidation, or worse." Malcolm's fingers curled around the document. "And this development project, it's linked to Richard Donovan, isn't it?" Lopez gave a slow nod. "The mayor and a group of private investors have been working behind the scenes, acquiring properties in areas they want to revitalize. The problem is, people like Carter won't leave without a fight, so they find ways to remove them." Malcolm's stomach churned. "And what happens to these people once they've been forced out?" Lopez hesitated, then finally answered. "Some end up in jail. Some take plea deals to avoid longer sentences. Others disappear." A silence settled over the room. Lopez cleared his throat. "You need to be careful, Hayes. They're not just coming for Carter. They're coming for anyone who gets in their way." Malcolm looked up, his voice steady. "Let them try." The next morning, Malcolm walked into the courthouse, a folder tucked beneath his arm. The hallways smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, the usual blend of bureaucracy and power. The preliminary detention hearing was about to begin, a chance for him to argue that Andre should be released until trial. But he already knew the battle he was walking into. As he stepped into the courtroom, he locked eyes with Judge Henry Whitmore. The older man sat behind the high bench, his expression neutral, but Malcolm had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind. Andre sat at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked exhausted, but when he saw Malcolm, there was something in his gaze. Hope, maybe. Or maybe just the faintest belief that someone was still fighting for him. Across the room, James Calloway stood confidently, his suit crisp, his smirk barely contained. As the hearing began, Malcolm laid out his case. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case is based on weak evidence. My client has a spotless record. He's a respected educator. There is no legitimate reason for him to remain in custody while awaiting trial." Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Calloway, what does the prosecution have to say?" Calloway stepped forward smoothly. "Your Honor, we believe the defendant poses a potential risk to public safety. While Mr. Carter may not have a criminal record, we cannot ignore the gravity of the charges. We have reason to believe that if released, he may attempt to flee or, worse, retaliate against witnesses." Malcolm's eyebrows shot up. "That is absolutely baseless." Whitmore held up a hand. "Counselor, let him finish." Malcolm gritted his teeth as Calloway continued. "We also have concerns about Mr. Carter's ties to certain activist groups," Calloway said smoothly. "Groups known for their disruptive tendencies." There it was. The coded language. The quiet insinuation that Andre wasn't just a suspect, he was a problem. Malcolm stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is character assassination. The prosecution has provided no evidence that my client is a flight risk, nor that he has any violent affiliations. Whitmore sighed, tapping his gavel lightly. The court has reviewed the circumstances, and I find that the prosecution's concerns are valid. Mr. Carter will remain in custody until trial. A hush fell over the room. Andre's shoulders sagged. Malcolm's fists tightened. This was never a fair fight. Hours later, Malcolm was back in his office, staring at his computer screen when his phone buzzed. It was Samantha. "You need to turn on the news," she said, urgency in her voice. Malcolm grabbed the remote and flipped to a local station. A breaking news banner stretched across the screen. Chicago teacher Andre Carter connected to multiple criminal networks, sources say. His stomach dropped. A suited anchor read from a teleprompter. New information suggests that Carter, who was arrested last week, may have ties to a larger criminal organization. While details remain unclear, sources indicate that his involvement in the recent robbery may only be part of a broader pattern. Malcolm felt his pulse in his ears. "They're controlling the narrative," Samantha said over the phone. "They're turning him into a villain before he even steps into court." Malcolm ran a hand over his face. The war wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was on the airwaves, in the headlines, in the minds of the public. And whoever was pulling the strings, they weren't stopping anytime soon. "If the system is rigged, we'll have to fight outside of it," Samantha whispered, sliding a USB drive across the table. Malcolm took the drive, rolling it between his fingers. They sat in the back corner of a dimly lit diner, the kind where the coffee was cheap and the waitresses didn't ask questions. Rain drummed against the windows, adding to the quiet tension between them. Samantha leaned forward. "This isn't just some internal memo, Malcolm. It's a recording, an off-the-books meeting between Richard Donovan and some of the most powerful people in this city. It proves they're not just manipulating the justice system. They're deciding who gets to have a future and who doesn't." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "And Andre's name came up?" She nodded. "They mentioned him, not by name, but it's obvious. He wasn't arrested because of some mistaken identity or a flawed case. He was a problem that needed to be dealt with." His grip on the drive tightened. "How'd you get this?" "A source in City Hall," she said. "They risked a lot to get it to me." Malcolm stared at the small device, his mind racing. If what she was saying was true, this was the break they needed. But it also meant they weren't just dealing with corrupt cops or a biased judge anymore. They were up against the city itself. Later that night, Malcolm sat in his office, the glow from his laptop screen the only light in the room. He inserted the USB and clicked on the audio file. The first few seconds were static, then voices. Muted at first, then clearer. A deep voice spoke first. "We can't afford another delay. The plan moves forward, no matter what." A second voice, more controlled. "Carter is a loose end. If people like him keep getting in the way, we'll never get the approvals we need." Then a voice Malcolm recognized instantly. Richard Donovan. "We've handled people like this before," the mayor said, his tone casual, as if discussing city ordinances instead of human lives. "It's a simple fix. Find the right officer, set up the right scenario. He'll be locked up before he even knows what's happening." Malcolm's blood ran cold. There was no hesitation, no concern about morality or consequences. Just men in a room, deciding fates like gods flipping coins. Then another voice joined in. "And what about the lawyer?" "Hayes. He's not letting this go." A pause. Then Donovan again. "If he keeps pushing, we'll deal with him too." Malcolm's jaw tightened. They weren't just targeting Andre. They were watching him too. The next morning, as Malcolm sat in his office, exhausted but more determined than ever, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. Older, with weathered skin and a coat that looked like it had seen better days. He hesitated before stepping inside. "You Malcolm Hayes?" Malcolm nodded. "Who's asking?" The man glanced over his shoulder before stepping forward. "Name's Daryl Henson. You might know me as the guy who helped put your client behind bars." Malcolm's pulse spiked. He gestured for the man to sit. "Go on." Daryl swallowed, his fingers tapping against his knee. They told me to say I saw Carter running from the robbery. Told me I'd be doing the city a favor. That if I cooperated, they'd make sure I was taken care of. And you believe them? Malcolm asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Daryl gave a bitter chuckle. You ever been on the streets, lawyer? Ever had to pick between freezing to death or saying what they want you to say? Malcolm stayed quiet. Daryl shook his head. They promised me a warm bed, some cash, maybe even a shot at getting off the streets. I didn't know they were setting that man up for something bigger. I just thought it was another case. Malcolm studied him carefully. And why are you here now? Daryl sighed. Because they didn't keep their promise, and because I watched the news last night. Carter ain't the man they're making him out to be, and neither are you. Hope flickered inside Malcolm. You're willing to testify? Daryl hesitated. I don't know. These people, they don't just let things go. Malcolm nodded slowly. I can protect you, but you have to be willing to stand up. Daryl exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I just need some time. Time isn't something we have, Malcolm said. Before Daryl could answer, a loud bang echoed from outside. A car door slamming. Daryl's face went pale. They found me. Malcolm stood up, moving toward the window. But before he could look outside, Daryl bolted for the door. Wait! Too late. Malcolm ran out after him, but by the time he reached the street, Daryl was already gone. Vanished. That night, Malcolm sat at his desk, trying to figure out his next move. His mind reeled. They had the recording. They had the proof of police corruption. They had a witness, except now that witness was missing. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice distorted, unnatural. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Walk away while you still can. The line went dead. Malcolm stared at the phone in his hand. He wasn't walking away, not now, not ever. Malcolm tightened his grip on his phone. The distorted voice had been clear. He was being watched. But by whom? And how far would they go to silence him? He exhaled, slipping his phone into his pocket, scanning the street outside his office. The city lights cast long shadows, turning parked cars and alleyways into hiding spots. He had always known fighting this case would put a target on his back. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in. Pushing the thought aside, he refocused on the most urgent task, finding Daryl Henson. The next morning, Malcolm and Samantha drove toward the west side of the city, where the homeless encampments stretched under the overpasses and along abandoned lots. The air was thick with the scent of damp cardboard and burnt food from makeshift stoves. Samantha adjusted her camera bag, scanning the area as they stepped out of the car. We should be careful. If someone got to him, they might still be around. Malcolm nodded, his jaw tight. We're running out of time. If Daryl is alive, we need to find him before they make sure he never talks. They moved cautiously through the encampment, past clusters of tents and shopping carts filled with whatever belongings people could hold on to. Excuse me, Malcolm said, approaching an older man warming his hands over a small fire. We're looking for someone. Daryl Henson. The man's expression flickered with something Malcolm couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. He shook his head quickly. Ain't seen him, Samantha pressed gently. We just want to help him. A younger man nearby, hood pulled low over his face, let out a dry laugh. You won't find him here. He's gone. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Gone where? The man hesitated, then glanced around before lowering his voice. Cops came last night. No sirens, no lights, just a black SUV. Took him. No one saw him after that. Samantha shot Malcolm a glance. They're tying up loose ends. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, a mix of anger and frustration burning inside him. We need to find out where they took him. That night, Malcolm met Detective Lopez in a quiet parking lot near the riverfront, far from prying eyes. Lopez leaned against his car, arms crossed. You don't give up, do you? Not when an innocent man's life is on the line, Malcolm shot back. Lopez sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I shouldn't even be here. If they find out I'm talking to you. They already know I'm digging, Malcolm interrupted. That's why Daryl Henson was taken last night. Where is he, Lopez? Lopez hesitated, torn. Malcolm could see the internal war playing out in the detective's tense posture, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. "If I tell you," Lopez finally said, voice low, "I'm done. My badge, my pension, everything." Malcolm studied him. "And if you stay quiet, how many more men like Andre get swallowed up by this system?" Lopez let out a bitter chuckle. "You think it's that simple? This job, this city, it doesn't work the way you want it to, Hayes. There's a machine running things and we're all just gears in it. You try to stop it, it'll grind you to dust." Malcolm took a step closer. "Then maybe it's time to break the machine." Lopez looked at him for a long moment. Then with a resigned sigh, he pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket and handed it over. "The holding facility they took him to. It's off the books." Malcolm took the paper, glancing at the address. "You're making the right call." Lopez shook his head. "Number, I'm making the call that lets me sleep at night." Back at his office, Malcolm paced the room, phone pressed to his ear. "I need you to run a story," he said the moment Samantha picked up. "You found him?" "I found where they took him, but if I go in alone, they'll make him disappear for good." Samantha didn't hesitate. "I'll go live with the story. We'll force their hand before they can bury this any deeper." Malcolm exhaled. "Make it count." By noon the next day, the news was everywhere. Weckern, breaking witness in Carter case missing, possibly taken by police. Samantha's face appeared on screens across the city as she delivered the report. "This case is no longer just about one man," she said. "It's about a pattern of corruption that's been allowed to fester for too long. And the people behind it, they are more concerned with hiding the truth than seeking justice." Within an hour, the backlash began. Mayor Richard Donovan appeared on a local news station, his expression set in manufactured concern. "These allegations are dangerous," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "People like Mr. Hayes and Ms. Reed are irresponsibly spreading misinformation, trying to turn the public against our police force. This is fear-mongering at its worst." The interviewer nodded along. "So you're saying this is all fabricated?" Donovan placed a hand over his heart. "I'm saying we will conduct a full investigation, but we must not allow people to sow division in our city." Malcolm watched the broadcast from his office, jaw locked. "This is damage control," Samantha muttered beside him. "They're trying to get ahead of the story." Then another face appeared on screen, James Calloway. "The district attorney's office takes these claims very seriously," Calloway said, his voice smooth as ever. "We will review the matter thoroughly, but let's not lose sight of the real issue. Andre Carter is accused of a serious crime. The focus should be on justice for the victims." Malcolm's hands curled into fists. "They're setting the narrative," Samantha muttered. "They're trying," Malcolm corrected, "but they're about to lose control of it." That evening, as Malcolm locked up his office, the unease in his gut grew stronger. He walked to his car, keys in hand, the dim glow of the street lamp casting long shadows along the pavement. Then, just as he reached for the door handle, he felt it before he saw it, the heavy presence of someone watching. Every instinct in him screamed danger. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. But there was nothing, only the steady hum of the city at night. Then from the shadows, a voice, low, cold. "You're pushing too hard, Hayes." His heart slammed against his ribs. He took a step back, his pulse thrumming. But before he could respond, the voice was gone. The figure melted back into the night. Malcolm exhaled sharply, gripping his car door. They were watching, and they were waiting. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Malcolm's pulse quickened. Was this it? Had he gone too far? His fingers instinctively curled into fists as he took a step back, scanning the dimly lit parking lot. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the rhythmic tap of shoes against concrete as the stranger approached. The figure was bundled in a long coat, hood pulled low, face obscured by the darkness. "You're looking in the wrong places," the stranger muttered, voice rough, hurried. Malcolm's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. "Who are you?" The figure ignored the question and reached into his coat. Malcolm tensed, but instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a small brown envelope and shoved it into Malcolm's hand. "Names, dates, proof." Malcolm's grip tightened around the package. Proof of what? Of what you already know. The man's breath was shallow, as if he had been running. They got to him. You're next. A cold chill ran down Malcolm's spine. Who got to him? The man took a quick step back, glancing over his shoulder. Don't be here too long. They're watching you now. And before Malcolm could press for more, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. Back in his office, Malcolm locked the door before tearing open the envelope. A stack of papers slid onto his desk, each one more damning than the last. A list of names, people who had been arrested under suspicious circumstances. Many were activists, educators, or vocal members of their communities. People like Andre. There were case files, each one highlighting inconsistencies in police reports, missing evidence, coerced confessions. And then, the worst of it, a ledger, a detailed account of money exchanged between private developers and city officials. Malcolm's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There it was in black and white. Direct financial ties between Mayor Richard Donovan's office and the real estate firms buying up displaced neighborhoods. It wasn't just about Andre. It was a systematic operation. The accusations were no longer speculation. This was the kind of proof that could take them down. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, exhaling. This changed everything, or at least he thought it did, until the next morning. He barely made it through his first cup of coffee when the pounding on his office door started. By the time he reached it, the door burst open, and a swarm of uniformed officers stormed in, their movements swift and precise. Malcolm Hayes, the lead officer announced, holding up a warrant. Step away from the desk. Malcolm's pulse kicked into overdrive. What the hell is this? We have a warrant to search your office. Suspicion of interfering with an active investigation and possession of unlawfully obtained evidence. Malcolm's jaw clenched. That's ridiculous. The officer didn't flinch. Step back, sir. Malcolm's stomach twisted as they began tearing through his office, rifling through drawers, confiscating documents. One officer grabbed his laptop, another pulled files off the shelves. Then they reached the envelope. That's privileged material, Malcolm snapped, stepping forward. Not anymore, the officer said, slipping the papers into an evidence bag. We'll take it from here. Malcolm barely heard the rest. His mind raced. They were taking the evidence, the same files that could prove everything. This wasn't just intimidation. This was erasure. An hour later, Malcolm sat in a cramped interrogation room at the police precinct. The fluorescent light buzzed above him, its harsh glow making everything feel surreal. Across the table, James Calloway sat, his usual smirk just a little more pronounced. You have a habit of putting your nose where it doesn't belong, Calloway mused, straightening his tie. Malcolm leaned back, arms crossed. You must be feeling pretty desperate if this is your next move. Calloway chuckled. Come on, Hayes. We both know how this ends. You're trying to fight a battle that's already been decided. Malcolm tilted his head. Is that what you told Andre Carter? That his life was decided before he even got to fight for it? Calloway's smirk faltered, just for a second. Carter is a criminal suspect. No, he's an inconvenience, Malcolm interrupted. And so am I. Calloway sighed dramatically. You know, I tried to warn you. I even offered you a way out. But you just couldn't take the hint. Malcolm's eyes darkened. You raided my office to destroy evidence. That's obstruction, Calloway. You're playing a dangerous game. Calloway leaned forward, his tone dropping. You think you're untouchable because you have a law degree? Because you can make a good speech in court? He scoffed. You're nothing compared to the people pulling these strings. Malcolm met his gaze without blinking. Then I guess I'll just have to start cutting those strings. Calloway's jaw twitched, but before he could respond, the door swung open. A uniformed officer entered, glancing at Calloway. Sir, we have to release him. We don't have grounds for detention. Malcolm smirked. Calloway took a slow breath, then stood. He straightened his tie, regaining his composure. Enjoy your freedom, Hayes, he murmured. While you still have it. By the time Malcolm walked out of the precinct, Samantha was waiting for him outside, phone in hand. Are you okay? She asked. Malcolm let out a dry laugh. Define okay. Samantha sighed. They're trying to bury this. They already did, Malcolm corrected. They raided my office and took everything. The witness is missing, and now I have nothing to prove what's happening." Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we need another approach." Malcolm ran a hand through his hair. "We don't just need another approach. We need something they can't erase." Samantha hesitated, then glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "We need to find that missing witness." Malcolm looked at her, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was it, the line between fighting a legal battle and walking straight into a war. But he already knew his answer. "We find him," Malcolm said, "before it's too late." Malcolm clenched his fists. If they couldn't find the missing witness, Andre was doomed. The clock was ticking. Samantha paced beside him, phone clutched in her hand. "We're running out of leads, Malcolm." He exhaled, dragging a hand over his face. They had spent the last 12 hours chasing every possible connection, but Daryl Henson had vanished. If they didn't find him before the next court session, the case was as good as lost. Then Samantha's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. "What is it?" Malcolm asked. She turned the screen toward him. A single message, no name attached. "He's alive, but not for long. Cornerstone Security, 1987 West Fulton." Malcolm's stomach tightened. A private security firm. It wasn't uncommon for corrupt officials to use places like that as unofficial holding facilities, somewhere off the books, where the rules didn't apply. Samantha's voice was low. "It's a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Malcolm said. "But what choice do we have?" 30 minutes later, Malcolm and Samantha sat in an unmarked car outside Cornerstone Security, a squat concrete building surrounded by a chain-link fence. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few black SUVs with tinted windows. Detective Lopez sat in the driver's seat, arms crossed. "This is a bad idea." "We need him," Malcolm said. Lopez exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. "If we get caught in there, I can't protect you. This isn't some backdoor evidence grab. This is a private firm with armed guards who don't play by the rules." "Then we don't get caught," Samantha said simply. Lopez shot her a look. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all day." Malcolm leaned forward. "Are you in or out?" Lopez shook his head. "I already put my career on the line giving you that location. But hell, I'm already halfway in. Let's get this over with." Lopez led the way toward the entrance, flashing his badge at the security desk. The guard barely looked up. "Routine check," Lopez said smoothly. "Security compliance." The guard sighed, clicking a button that unlocked the inner door. "Make it quick." As they stepped inside, Malcolm scanned the hallway. The place was cold, sterile, filled with locked doors and security cameras at every turn. Lopez muttered under his breath, "I don't like this." "Where would they keep him?" Samantha asked. Lopez glanced toward a hallway to the left. "Detainees, if they have any, would be in holding cells, basement level." Malcolm nodded. "Let's move." They found the stairs and descended quickly, heartbeats pounding in unison. At the bottom, Lopez used his credentials to bypass a security door. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and disinfectant. Then they heard it, a low, raspy voice coming from the last cell. Malcolm hurried forward, gripping the metal bars. Inside, Daryl Henson sat hunched on a cot, his face bruised, his lips split. His eyes widened when he saw them. "Daryl," Malcolm said, voice urgent. "We're getting you out." Daryl coughed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too late. They said they'd kill me if I talked." "No one's killing you," Samantha said firmly. "We need to move." Lopez pulled a key card from his belt and swiped it over the lock. The door clicked open, but before they could step inside, a sharp buzz rang through the hall. The alarm. Malcolm cursed. "They know we're here," Lopez muttered. Footsteps thundered from above. "Time to go," Samantha said. Daryl struggled to his feet, wincing. Malcolm threw his arm over his shoulders, helping him forward. Then the guards appeared at the far end of the hall. 3 of them, armed, moving fast. "Move!" Lopez barked, stepping forward to slow them down. Samantha grabbed Daryl's other arm, pulling him toward the stairs. "Come on!" Malcolm didn't look back. If they stopped now, they'd never make it out. They burst through the exit and into the parking lot just as more guards swarmed the front door. Lopez grabbed his radio, barking orders into it. "Active police officer, stand down or face charges of unlawful detainment." It bought them a few precious seconds, just enough time for Malcolm and Samantha to shove Daryl into the back seat of her car. As soon as the doors slammed shut, Samantha floored the gas pedal. Gunmetal gray SUVs tore out of the parking lot behind them. "They're coming," Malcolm muttered, twisting in his seat. Samantha's hands were steady on the wheel. Then they'd better keep up. She wrenched the car onto a side street, tires screeching. The SUVs followed, but she was already 2 turns ahead, weaving through the grid of Chicago's back streets. Daryl groaned in the back seat. Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Malcolm said, still watching the road behind them. The SUVs didn't follow them past the freeway ramp. For now, they were in the clear. 15 minutes later, they pulled into an empty parking garage. The only sound was their heavy breathing as the adrenaline began to fade. Malcolm turned to Daryl, his expression serious. "You're safe now," he said, "but you need to tell us everything." Daryl swallowed hard, his hands still shaking. "You don't understand," he rasped. "It's not just Andre Carter. There's more." Malcolm's stomach dropped. "How much more?" Daryl's bloodshot eyes met his. "They're planning something bigger, and if you don't stop them now, it's going to get worse." Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. The case wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. This was something much darker. The witness sat trembling, looking at Malcolm and Samantha. "If I talk, they'll kill me." Daryl Henson's hands were shaking as he clutched a battered old cassette recorder. His face, still bruised from his time in the private facility, was etched with exhaustion and fear. Malcolm sat across from him in the dimly lit parking garage, his voice steady but urgent. "You've already risked your life coming this far. But if we don't expose them now, they'll keep doing this. To Andre, to others. You know that." Daryl swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I have proof." His voice cracked. "They made me lie about Andre Carter." Samantha leaned in, her gaze sharp. "Who's they?" Daryl took a shaky breath, then clicked a button on the recorder. A grainy voice filled the air, raspy, calculated. "You want to be useful, don't you, Daryl?" It was James Calloway. Malcolm and Samantha exchanged glances. Another voice followed. "Carter's the one. Just say you saw him. We'll take care of the rest." A third voice cut in, cold, authoritative. "This has to be clean. No loose ends." Then came the real bombshell. "The mayor wants this handled before it blows back on him. Whitmore's already on board. We push it through and we're done." The recording ended with a click. Silence hung in the air. Malcolm exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. This was it. Proof that the corruption ran straight to the top. Mayor Richard Donovan, Judge Henry Whitmore, and James Calloway himself. Samantha's mind was already racing. "This isn't just about Andre anymore. This is a conspiracy." Daryl rubbed his forehead. "I didn't want to do it, but they—" He swallowed, voice breaking. "They said they'd make me disappear if I didn't." Malcolm's expression softened. "We're going to make this right." Daryl's bloodshot eyes met his. "How?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "We take this to the public." Samantha worked fast. Within the hour, she had isolated the most damning parts of the recording and prepared a live broadcast. They sat in a small motel room, shades drawn, laptops open. The clock ticked past midnight, but adrenaline kept them awake. "This will force their hand," Samantha said, adjusting the microphone. "They'll either have to respond or expose how deep the cover-up goes." Malcolm's gut churned. He knew this move put targets on all of their backs. "Once this is out there," he warned, "there's no undoing it." Samantha's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Then let's make it count." She clicked Live. The screen flashed. Samantha's face appeared, sharp and resolute. "This is Samantha Reed with the Chicago Tribune. We have evidence that the wrongful arrest of Andre Carter was orchestrated by some of the highest-ranking officials in this city." She played the recording, the names, the voices, the undeniable proof. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Justice for Andre Carter trended within the hour. The news cycle picked up the story. CNN, MSNBC, local stations. Everyone was talking about it. Calloway, Whitmore, Donovan. Their names were now national headlines. But the moment the broadcast ended, Malcolm's stomach dropped. Samantha's phone vibrated, then Malcolm's, then Daryl's. The same message. Unknown number. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Outside the motel, headlights flickered in the darkness. They weren't safe anymore. Malcolm gripped his phone tighter. The voice on the other end was calm, calculated. Walk away, Malcolm, before it's too late. A quiet hum filled the line, as if the speaker was waiting for him to acknowledge the threat. He didn't. Instead, he let the silence stretch until the caller exhaled sharply. You think you're winning this fight? The voice was laced with quiet amusement. You're out of your league. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, forcing his heartbeat to slow. If that were true, you wouldn't have called. A pause, then the line went dead. He stared at the phone for a moment, jaw tightening. They were rattled. That meant he was getting close. Samantha, sitting across the motel room with her laptop open, didn't look up. Another anonymous threat? Malcolm tossed the phone onto the table. They're desperate. They're trying to scare us. Samantha didn't argue. They both knew fear was an effective weapon, if you let it control you. Across the room, Daryl Henson sat hunched in a chair, his face drawn. His hands fidgeted in his lap, still visibly shaken from the events of the past few days. They won't stop, will they? He asked quietly. No, Malcolm admitted, but neither will we. The next morning, Malcolm and Samantha met Detective Lopez in an underground parking garage. He looked tired, shoulders tense as he scanned the area before speaking. You don't have much time, Lopez muttered. Calloway is leaning on Whitmore hard. He's trying to get your evidence dismissed before it ever sees a courtroom. Malcolm crossed his arms. On what grounds? Same as always. Chain of custody, admissibility, procedural violations. They're throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. Lopez ran a hand down his face. I don't know how much longer I can do this, Malcolm. If they find out I've been feeding you intel, I'm done. You're already in this, Malcolm said evenly. You made that choice when you decided to do the right thing. Lopez let out a bitter chuckle. Yeah, well, doing the right thing doesn't come with job security. Samantha tapped her phone against her thigh. We need to get ahead of them. How? Lopez asked. Malcolm's mind was already working through the possibilities. We take it to the people before they can silence it. Samantha looked at him sharply. A press conference? Bigger than that, Malcolm said. We go live, right now. Within an hour, they were streaming. Samantha sat at the center of the camera frame, voice steady, gaze unwavering. The people of Chicago and the entire country deserve to know the truth. She laid it all out. The false arrest, the missing evidence, the corruption, then she played the recording. The voices of James Calloway, Judge Whitmore, and Mayor Donovan filled the air. Their words were damning, undeniable, and the internet exploded. Viewers flooded in, comments pouring across the screen in real time. News stations picked up the stream within minutes. Justice for Andra Carter began trending again, but this time it was bigger. This time the country was watching. Then the real pressure started. Phone calls, journalists demanding statements, politicians forced to respond. For the first time, the system was on the defensive. Hours later, Malcolm's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. A familiar voice, tight with controlled anger. Mr. Hayes, Mayor Donovan said, I suggest you reconsider your choices. Malcolm smirked. You mean reconsider exposing the truth? You think grandstanding on the internet makes you untouchable? Donovan's voice darkened. You've made a lot of enemies today. And you've made a lot of mistakes, Malcolm countered, starting with underestimating how many people are done listening to your lies. A beat of silence. Then Donovan chuckled, low and menacing. Let's see how cocky you are when you're the one behind bars. The line clicked dead. Malcolm barely had time to process the threat before his office phone buzzed. A summons from the courthouse. He was being called in. Immediately. When he arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Whitmore sat at the bench, his expression stone cold, but Malcolm could see the irritation in his stiff posture. James Calloway sat at the prosecution's table, the smug smirk barely contained. This court is in session, Whitmore announced. The matter before us concerns the unlawful actions of defense attorney Malcolm Hayes. The words barely landed before the door slammed open. A group of officers strode in, their movements precise, rehearsed. The lead officer stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice." Samantha gasped from the back of the courtroom. Malcolm's lips curled into a smile. "They're really that scared, huh?" Whitmore banged his gavel. "Remove him from my courtroom." As the officers grabbed his arms, Malcolm glanced over his shoulder at Samantha. "Keep the pressure on," he said calmly. "We're just getting started." Handcuffs clicked around Malcolm's wrists. He kept his head high, even as cameras flashed around him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The officers led him down the courthouse steps, their grip firm but unnecessarily tight, as if to send a message. The reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping. "Mr. Hayes, do you have a statement? Is it true you've been tampering with evidence? Do you regret your actions?" Malcolm said nothing. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of looking rattled. Behind him, Samantha was shouting into her phone, already working damage control. Daryl Henson watched from the sidelines, his eyes wide with fear. And somewhere in the crowd, Malcolm caught sight of James Calloway, standing just far enough away to avoid the chaos, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. This was the plan all along. They weren't just trying to silence Malcolm, they wanted to discredit him. Inside the holding cell, the noise of the courthouse faded into a low hum. Malcolm sat on the metal bench, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had dug into his skin. Hours passed. Then the door opened and Detective Lopez walked in. He hesitated, then sat across from Malcolm, elbows on his knees. "You're in deep," Lopez said, voice low. Malcolm smirked. "And you're just now figuring that out?" Lopez let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "They want to make an example out of you. Calloway, the mayor, the whole damn system. You poked the beast and now it's coming after you." Malcolm leaned forward. "So, are you here to warn me? Or are you finally ready to do something about it?" Lopez looked at the floor. He was a cop, a good one, at his core. But he had spent years inside a system that didn't reward honesty. If he stepped out of line, he would be next. "Tell me something," Malcolm said. "How many more innocent men have to rot in cells before you decide which side you're on?" Lopez's jaw clenched. Then finally he looked up. "I'll testify," he said. Malcolm sat back, exhaling. This was it, the first crack in the armor. Hours later, the chaos outside the courthouse had only grown. Protesters lined the sidewalks, some holding signs in support of Malcolm, others shouting about law and order. Inside, Samantha was fighting her own battle. She sat before a congressional oversight committee, her laptop open, documents spread across the table. Across from her, stiff-faced federal officials listened as she laid out the evidence. "This isn't about one corrupt prosecutor," she said. "It's about an entire system designed to protect those in power while exploiting those who can't fight back." She played the recording. The voices of Calloway, Whitmore, and Donovan filled the room. Across the country, the story exploded. Major networks picked it up. Civil rights groups issued statements. Even politicians who had once ignored the case started making public calls for an investigation. And then, the breaking point. A leaked phone call, one that wasn't supposed to exist. A conversation between Judge Whitmore and Mayor Donovan, discussing how to bury evidence and manipulate the case. Malcolm listened from his cell as the news played on a small television mounted to the wall. He couldn't help but smile. Whitmore had finally slipped. And now the whole world knew it. Less than 24 hours after his arrest, Malcolm was released. He stepped out of the courthouse to a storm of cameras and flashing lights. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes tired, but he stood tall. Samantha was waiting, a small smirk playing at her lips. "You made the headlines again." Malcolm exhaled, then turned to the nearest camera. "This fight isn't over," he said, voice steady. "It's only just begun." Malcolm's voice echoed through the crowd. "This fight isn't over. It's only just begun." But deep inside, he knew. The real battle was just beginning. The moment he stepped down from the courthouse steps, his phone was already buzzing with notifications. News outlets dissected his release, social media debates flared, and political commentators speculated on the fallout. But Malcolm didn't have time to watch it unfold. He had work to do. Samantha caught up to him as they weaved through the crowd. "We forced their hand," she said. Now let's see how they play it. They didn't have to wait long. By the time they reached Malcolm's office, the FBI had launched an official probe. The agency released a statement confirming an internal investigation into Mayor Richard Donovan, Judge Henry Whitmore, and multiple members of the city's justice system. More importantly, some officers were starting to crack. A local reporter from the Chicago Tribune managed to secure an interview with an anonymous police officer. The officer admitted that they had been pressured to fabricate evidence in several cases, including Andre Carter's. "We didn't have a choice," the voice on the recording said. "If we didn't go along with it, our careers were over, or worse." The walls were closing in on City Hall, but that only made Donovan more dangerous. Inside a dimly lit boardroom, Mayor Richard Donovan met with his closest advisors. He tapped a thick file against the polished mahogany table. "This situation is spiraling. We need to take control of the narrative." James Calloway sat across from him, arms crossed. "The FBI is breathing down our necks. If they start flipping people, it's only a matter of time before they reach us." Judge Whitmore leaned forward. "Then we stall. I'll delay the court hearings, file motions, whatever it takes. If we can buy a few more weeks, this will blow over." Donovan wasn't convinced. "That only works if the media stops running this story." Calloway smirked. "Then let's make sure they have a reason to stop." The attack came fast. That evening, a formal motion was filed to dismiss all evidence Malcolm had gathered, claiming it was illegally obtained and unverifiable. Calloway made a public statement, standing outside the courthouse, cameras flashing. "These so-called revelations are based on manipulated evidence, gathered by individuals with a clear political agenda." Within hours, news networks began casting doubt on Malcolm's case. Experts debated whether the recordings had been tampered with. Some claimed the witnesses were unreliable. Others outright suggested Malcolm had fabricated the entire conspiracy to boost his career. The pressure was mounting. Then the threats escalated. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Malcolm woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. A text. "Unknown number, this is your last warning. Walk away." Attached was a photo of his parents' house. His blood ran cold. Samantha, who had been working late in the office, noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" Malcolm handed her the phone. Her face darkened as she read the message. "They're making it personal." He clenched his jaw. They wanted to scare him, to break him, but fear had never stopped him before. By morning, the situation worsened. Daryl Henson was gone. The halfway house where he had been staying reported him missing. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just gone. Malcolm ran a hand through his hair, frustration tightening his chest. This isn't a coincidence. They know he's the key. Samantha was already making calls. "I'll put pressure on every local station. If he was taken, someone saw something." Then Malcolm's phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't an anonymous number. It was Lopez. His voice was urgent. "They're moving him." Malcolm straightened. "Who?" "Daryl. I don't know where yet, but if we don't act now—" Lopez hesitated. "We'll never see him again." Malcolm grabbed his coat. "Then let's go get him." Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Where are they taking him?" Lopez's voice was tight with urgency. "Somewhere off the grid. We don't have much time." Malcolm barely registered his own movements as he grabbed his keys and rushed toward the door. Samantha was right behind him, phone in hand, already trying to track the vehicle. "Black unmarked SUV," Lopez said over the line, "heading west, past Lower Wacker Drive." Malcolm threw open the car door, barely waiting for Samantha to buckle in before peeling out onto the street. The city blurred around them, neon reflections flickering on rain-slicked pavement. "We're not losing him," Malcolm muttered, pressing the gas pedal harder. They spotted the SUV 3 blocks ahead, weaving through light, late-night traffic. Samantha kept her eyes on her screen. "If they take the ramp toward the industrial district, we're screwed. That area is a maze." Malcolm gritted his teeth. "Then we don't let them get that far." He hit the accelerator. The sedan shot forward, closing the gap. Lopez, driving his own car behind them, cut into the opposite lane, forcing the SUV to slow at an intersection. For a moment, Malcolm thought they had them cornered, until the SUV swerved sharply, dodging a truck and barreled down a side street. "They're running," Samantha said. "No kidding," Malcolm muttered, gripping the wheel. They followed the SUV onto a deserted stretch of road near the riverfront. The industrial district loomed ahead, warehouses, train tracks, places where people could disappear without a trace. "We need to stop them now," Lopez said through the phone. "If they get any farther—" Malcolm didn't wait for him to finish. He veered right, cutting across a loading dock, coming up parallel to the SUV. For a split second, he saw Daryl Henson through the tinted window, head slumped, hands tied. Then the SUV jerked left, trying to ram them off the road. Malcolm barely reacted in time, tires screeching as he swerved to avoid impact. Lopez, seeing the opportunity, hit the sirens on his unmarked police car and pulled ahead, flashing his badge out the window. "Pull over," he commanded. The SUV hesitated, then skidded to a sudden halt. Malcolm slammed his brakes, throwing the car into park. Lopez was already out, gun drawn, as he approached the driver's side. Samantha grabbed her camera and jumped out right behind him. "Open the door," Lopez ordered. Silence. Then, the locks clicked. The back door swung open. Inside, Daryl Henson was slumped against the seat, wrists zip-tied, mouth duct-taped. His wide, terrified eyes met Malcolm's. The driver, a plainclothes officer Malcolm recognized from the courthouse, raised his hands. "We were just transporting him." "Save it," Lopez snapped. "Get out of the car." Malcolm pushed past them, cutting the ties from Daryl's wrists. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Daryl's breath was shaky. "They were going to kill me." Malcolm's chest tightened. Not arrest him, not hold him, eliminate him. Samantha had her camera rolling. The whole world was about to see this. They brought Daryl to a safe house on the outskirts of town, a place Malcolm knew was secure. The air was thick with tension as they sat in the dimly lit room. Lopez stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes scanning the windows like he expected an ambush. Daryl was still trembling. He held a cup of water with both hands, but Malcolm could see the slight shake in his fingers. "They told me no one could protect me," Daryl murmured. Malcolm sat across from him. "They were wrong." Daryl swallowed hard, then looked up. "I'll testify." The words settled over the room like an electric charge. Malcolm leaned forward. "You're sure?" Daryl nodded, voice firmer this time. "I'm tired of running." Samantha exhaled. This could change everything. Malcolm was about to respond when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. His fingers hovered for a second before he answered. A familiar voice filled his ear. "Mayor Donovan." "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Donovan's tone was eerily calm. Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "I could say the same about you." There was a soft chuckle on the other end. "I admire your persistence. Truly. But this fight, it's not one you can win." Malcolm glanced at Samantha, who was already pulling out her recorder. "Sounds like you're worried." Donovan ignored the jab. "I'm calling with a solution, a way to end this before it gets worse." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "I'm listening." There was a slight pause before Donovan continued. "You drop this case, walk away. In return, I'll make sure Andre Carter is released. Today, no charges, no trial. He walks free." Malcolm didn't speak. Donovan continued, voice smooth as ever. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? The whole reason you started this. You get your victory. Carter goes home. And you—" he chuckled. "You keep your career, your reputation, maybe even your life." Silence. Samantha was watching Malcolm carefully. Lopez stood still, waiting. Daryl's hands clenched around his cup. Finally, Malcolm exhaled. "Tell Donovan—" He paused, meeting Samantha's gaze. "Tell him he's already lost." And he hung up. Malcolm placed his phone down. The decision was made. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Samantha was watching him closely, waiting for confirmation of what they all knew was coming. "He's going to come after you even harder now," she said. Malcolm exhaled. "Let him." Across the room, Lopez was already on the phone, coordinating with federal agents. The FBI was watching now. That gave them some protection, but it also meant time was running out. "They'll try to fast-track Andre's conviction," Lopez said as he hung up. "Calloway's moving to have the final hearing set within 48 hours. If we don't dismantle this case before then, it won't matter what we've exposed." Malcolm nodded, already thinking through their next move. The next morning, the full weight of the city's corruption machine bore down on him. Two unmarked black cars idled outside his apartment. A new ethics complaint was filed against him at the Bar Association, questioning his handling of the Carter case. A well-known political columnist published an op-ed claiming that Malcolm was a reckless opportunist, more interested in fame than the law. It was an all-out offensive. But Malcolm had anticipated this. That afternoon, he walked into the federal courthouse with Darrell Henson by his side, trailed by an FBI security detail. The sight alone sent a ripple of tension through the hallways. The final hearing was set, and this time, Malcolm had his ace. Inside the packed courtroom, the energy was palpable. Andre Carter sat at the defendant's table, his face composed, but the weight of months behind bars evident in his posture. On the other side of the room, James Calloway looked supremely confident. Judge Henry Whitmore presided over the bench, as calm and detached as ever. But Malcolm could see the tension in his jaw. Then the doors opened, and Darrell Henson walked in. Gas rippled through the room. Calloway went rigid. Whitmore's fingers curled around his gavel, knuckles white. Malcolm suppressed a smirk. They hadn't expected this. Darrell took the witness stand, his voice shaky at first, but as he spoke, his words gained strength. "I was coerced into lying," he admitted, looking directly at the jury. "They told me what to say. They told me that if I didn't," he swallowed, "I wouldn't make it." Calloway stood, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is unreliable. The witness is a former drug addict, a known vagrant." "He's a man who was threatened by your office, Mr. Calloway," Malcolm shot back, "and we have proof." Samantha, sitting in the gallery, pressed play on a live feed. The recording filled the courtroom, Calloway's voice clear as day. "Carter's the one. Just say you saw him. We'll take care of the rest." The jury listened in stunned silence. Then another voice. "Judge Whitmore. This has to be clean. No loose ends." The room erupted. Calloway's face went pale. Whitmore's lips parted slightly, his carefully controlled expression faltering. Malcolm turned, facing the jury. His voice was steady, unwavering. "The system has failed, but today, justice wins." The gavel slammed down. Whitmore's voice was shaky. "Court is adjourned." The entire courtroom watched as Judge Henry Whitmore took a deep breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but even he knew there was no escaping this. The final decision was moments away. The jury foreman stood, a crisp sheet of paper trembling in his hands. He cleared his throat, his voice steady. "In the case of the people versus Andre Carter, we find the defendant not guilty." A wave of relief washed over the courtroom. Andre Carter's shoulders sagged, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table as if he needed to steady himself. His wife covered her mouth, tears already spilling down her cheeks. But the moment of victory was short-lived. From the back of the room, an FBI agent stepped forward, a badge gleaming under the fluorescent light. "Judge Whitmore," the agent announced, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "you are hereby suspended from your duties, pending a full federal investigation into judicial corruption." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Whitmore went pale. "You can't do this," he hissed, gripping the bench. "This is my courtroom." The agent didn't flinch. "Not anymore." And with that, the fall began. As news of the ruling spread, the walls of corruption that had protected Chicago's most powerful figures began to crumble. Prosecutor James Calloway barely had time to react before another set of agents moved toward him. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and prosecutorial misconduct," the lead investigator declared. Calloway stood frozen for a moment, his usual smug confidence wiped away. Then with a sneer, he muttered, "This is a goddamn circus." But the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and that was that. In the hours that followed, the FBI launched a full-scale raid on City Hall. Mayor Richard Donovan was already packing a suitcase when the agents arrived at his office. "Going somewhere, Mr. Mayor?" an agent asked, raising an eyebrow. Donovan barely looked at him. "I need to be in Washington for—" The agent held up an arrest warrant. "Not today, you don't." Within moments, he was in handcuffs, led past a mob of reporters shouting questions. What do you say about the corruption charges? Did you order the targeting of innocent citizens? Is it true you took bribes from private developers? Donovan kept his head down, but the story was already out. By nightfall, his face was on every news channel, labeled as the man who had weaponized the justice system for political and financial gain. Meanwhile, Senator Clark, one of Donovan's biggest allies, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Investigative journalists, armed with a treasure trove of leaked documents, exposed his role in funneling millions into private prisons, ensuring longer, harsher sentences for inmates, most of whom were from marginalized communities. He denied everything at first, claiming it was a political attack. But when the money trail led straight to his campaign donors, there was nothing left to spin. The Department of Justice opened an immediate inquiry, and just like that, the empire collapsed. Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, watching the city buzz with the aftermath of the case. It should have felt like a victory. Andre Carter was free. The people responsible were finally facing justice. But as Malcolm looked at Andre, he could see it, the scars that wouldn't heal. Andre wasn't the same man who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago, falsely accused. He had seen how fragile justice could be, how easily a life could be taken away without ever pulling a trigger. "Thank you," Andre said quietly. Malcolm nodded. "You don't owe me anything." Andre exhaled. "I do, but I don't know what happens next." Malcolm didn't either, because fixing one case wasn't the same as fixing the system, and they both knew this wasn't over. Detective Lopez stood at the courthouse steps, watching as his former colleagues shuffled by, some with guilt, others with resentment. He had made his decision long before today. He pulled his badge from his pocket and stared at it for a long time. Then, with a quiet finality, he set it on the courthouse steps. "I'm done," he murmured. Malcolm turned to him. "What will you do now?" Lopez gave a small, tired smile. "Something better." And he felt free. As Malcolm walked away from the courthouse, he felt the weight of the fight settle over him. Then a man in a dark suit approached him, slipping a folder into his hands. "This isn't over," the man said. His face was unreadable. "You got one, but there are more." Malcolm looked down. The file was thick. A new case, a new name, another victim of a system still built to crush them. He sighed, tucking the folder under his arm. He wasn't done yet. Justice still had a long way to go. Justice is never won in a single battle. It's a war fought in courtrooms, on the streets, and in the hearts of those who refuse to stay silent. Malcolm knew that exposing corruption wasn't the end. It was just another step in a much longer fight. The system wasn't broken by accident, and it wouldn't be fixed overnight. But what this case proved, what Andre Carter's story made undeniable, was that truth once uncovered had power. That standing up, even when the odds were stacked against you, could shake the foundations of injustice. So here's the real question. How many others are still waiting for their justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed injustice firsthand? What would you do if faced with a system designed to silence the truth? And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge, inspire, and make you think, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The fight isn't over, and neither are the stories we have to tell.